Happy Monday, 6th grade. As promised, Wednesday Wars. I always have to say this, so thank you, Scholastic, for letting us do read-alouds and putting them online. Gary Schmidt, Wednesday Wars. So, it's late at my house. Hopefully you're in bed, and when you watch this, it will be daytime hours and not late night hours, but this is when it's quiet at my house. So, I'm prepared. I have my sustenance, my Dr. Pepper, so I should be good to go for a few hours. That way if I get a little sore throat while I'm reading. So we are reading starting in April. So for me, that is page 184, if you're following along at home in your own book. So just a quick recap. For March, we had the Ides of March, which we talked about the Julius Caesar play. And in Julius Caesar, on the Ides of March, that was the day that he was fortune told or prophesied or whatever word you want to use, that it wasn't going to go well for him, that he was going to die. People were out to get him. Beware the Ides of March. So that date was like a Friday the 13th, which ironically, Friday the 13th for us was our last day in school. That was the last Friday, March 13th, that we saw each other face to face. So beware the Ides of March for us as well. So that happened. We had the rat disaster, right? Falling out of the ceilings. Gives me the heebie-jeebies, right? So you think these giant rats and Mrs. Sidman to the rescue, holding them and walking them down. And then in the end, they get out of the cage, chase Holling. He has his fastest speed ever. And then they end up getting smucked by a bus, which is kind of gross. But, you know, it happens. In some ways, it's like, well, now they're done. So that was March. So some bad things happen, some good things happen. But we still have Vietnam going on. We still have the war going on. We still have Lieutenant Baker missing. We don't know. We haven't heard anything. Is he found? Is he safe? Is he dead? We don't know. So we've got that going on. So we still have big world issues. We have school issues, right? Because we still have Holly, Mrs. Baker got observed, which is super stressful for adults. I'll just tell you that. Even if you're like super confident as a teacher, it is super stressful to have that happen. So she gets her big observation that day. The track thing happens, right? It's just a whole lot all in one day. So school, big world school stuff, and stuff in the family is still not great, right? Dad is, somehow architecture is a blood sport. You play for keeps, and he seems to not be such a nice guy these days, right? Mom, you don't hear much about. She just kind of does her thing. Sister's getting more irritable, right? She doesn't like the stuff going on for war. She's getting political. She's getting, following Bobby Kennedy, who at the time is running for president, which some of you can kind of understand that climate because obviously we're in an election year right now. So you can kind of understand what that is when somebody's, getting people to help them knock on doors, put out ads, shake hands, talk to people, things like that. She wants to do that for Bobby Kennedy. Dad obviously wants her working in the office. It doesn't go well, but in the end, Dad won because they talk about how dad and sister come back from work. So he obviously got his way where she's working for him. So we're going to go into April, and then I'll pause the video and do a second one for May. And I might just do June just to get them all out there. We'll see how it goes. So 184. The next week, Mrs. Sidman read the names of the 7 members of Camilla Junior High varsity cross-country team during morning announcements. We are very glad to have these 7 students represent our school, said Mrs. Sidman. Most especially Holling Hood, who will represent the 7th grade. Holling came in with the fastest time during tryouts, almost a minute faster than any of the 8th graders on the team. We wish you all luck, boys. This was frightening. It was the kind of stuff that makes you hope that you are never alone in the locker room with the other guys on your team. There wasn't much help from anyone in Mrs. Baker's class. I wonder why Holling had the fastest time, said Danny after the announcements, a whole lot louder than he had to. Could it be because he was running away from 2 rats who were trying to eat him? That might have had a little to do with it, I said. A little, said Danny. A little, said Marilee. A little, said Mai Tai. A very little, I said, and everyone in the class ripped out a piece of paper from their notebooks, scrunched it up, and threw it at me, which was unfair, since you can't stop 22 pieces of scrunched up paper at the same time. You pretty much know from what I said that Mrs. Baker wasn't in the room. She'd been called down to the office for a phone call before morning announcements, and she had Mr. Van Leary stay with us while she was gone. which is why balls of scrunched up paper surrounded my desk by the time Mrs. Baker came back. And since generally the person who is surrounded by balls of scrunched up paper will be the person blamed for all the balls of scrunched up paper, I figured I'd be the one who had to pick them all up. That's how it is in the world. But not this time. Because the phone call in the office was from the United States Army. The Viet Cong had abandoned Khe Sanh. So remember, Viet Cong is the Vietnamese troops, Vietnam, that were attacking the U.S. Marines, abandoned that site that they were laying siege to, throwing mortars and all this kind of stuff and burrowing underground. They abandoned it. So they backed off and said, nah, we're not going to waste our energies here. And 20,000 American troops were marching to relieve the Marines and to find the missing American soldiers like Lieutenant Baker. It will be called, Mrs. Baker told us, Operation Pegasus. Now, someone tell me the meaning of the classical allusion. She never did say anything about all the balls of scrunched up paper around my desk. You may have noticed, too, that it was Mrs. Sidman who read the morning announcements over the PA instead of Mr. Goreshi. That was because Mr. Goreshi was gone. Mrs. Baker told us he received an administrative reassignment, but that only meant he was gone, and Mrs. Sidman was our new principal. Really? I suppose the school board figured that if Mrs. Sidman could pick up 2 huge rats by the scruff of their necks and carry them through the halls, she could certainly handle middle schoolers, which is probably true. No one saw Mr. Goreshi leave, still looking for a small country to be a dictator of. But everyone saw Mrs. Sidman the first day she was principal. She stood in the main lobby and watched us come in. She already knew most all of our names, and she must have said good morning 300 times. She stood straight, with her arms folded across her chest, which, as any teacher coach will tell you, isn't good for teachers, but probably isn't bad for principals. I heard that she even stared down Doug Switek's brother. While Mrs. Sidman was starting up her new job at Camillo Junior High, President Lyndon B. Johnson was giving up his old one at the White House. Walter Cronkite carried the announcement the last day of March. President Johnson said he did not want to be distracted by partisan politics, with America's sons and fields far away and America's future under challenge right here at home. He decided he would not run for the presidency again. His whole face seemed to sag down as he said this. He doesn't want to be humiliated, said my sister at the first commercial that night. He knows he can't win against Bobby Kennedy. He knows he can't win against Richard Nixon, said my father, not with the whole war on his back. Either way, he's getting out because he doesn't want to lose, not because he cares about America's future. My father sighed a loud sigh. So is that how all flower children make their judgments, so quick and easy? When they're quick and easy to make, said my sister. Only the end of the commercial stopped what could have gotten a whole lot louder. I seemed to see President Johnson's sagging face through the rest of the news. Banquo's face probably looked a lot like that just before Macbeth had him killed, when he suddenly realized that everything he had hoped for was crashing down. And then on top of that, we found out after the CBS Evening News that President Johnson wasn't the only one giving up his job. Kowalski's finished too, said my father. We all looked at him. What do you mean, said my mother. Finished, said my father. Done, over, washed up, kaput. I told you, he couldn't play for keeps. They'll announce it in a couple weeks or so. No more Kowalski and Associates. We'll be the only architectural firm in town that matters. And he looked at me. I told you we'd be going places if we got the junior high job, didn't I? I nodded. He had told me. What about the Kowalskis? I asked. My father shrugged. Architecture is a blood sport, he said. So at lunch recess the next day, Merrill Lee and I spent a lot of time not saying anything. Until Merrill Lee said it for us. I might be moving, she said. I looked at her. I'll probably be moving. Where? I said. To my grandmother's house in Kingston. I nodded. Another minute or so of not saying anything went by. I knew I should say something. I guess after reading all that Shakespeare, I should know what to say, but I didn't have a single word. So Merrill Lee said it for us again. Toads, beetles, bats, she said. And that was exactly right. Merrill Lee didn't know how long she had left, maybe just 2 or 3 weeks. So we decided to pretend that it was forever. And we didn't talk about it, and we tried not to think about it. But there were those moments when one of us would look at the other, and we knew what we were thinking, even though we wouldn't say it. Probably sort of how it was between Romeo and Juliet. It helped to run hard, so hard that you couldn't think about much anything else because your arteries are all opened out as far as they can be, looking for some oxygen, any oxygen. because you can't pull enough air into your lungs. And there's this coach who's invented an entirely new vocabulary to wrap around the word faster, a vocabulary that even Caliban would have blushed at. We ran for more miles a day than most commuters drive. We ran through neighborhoods that I don't even think are in Nassau County. We ran past other junior high schools and got jeered at by baseball players who warmed up with a couple of sprints and then shagged balls the rest of the afternoon. We ran past the red tulips in front of St. Adalbert's and the white lilacs in front of Temple Beth El. We ran past Goldman's Best Bakery and smelled the latest batch of cream puffs, sending their scent through the open windows. One day, we ran all the way to Jones Beach, and if Mrs. Sidman hadn't sent a bus after us, I think we would have collapsed on the boardwalk and died. But I was getting faster, really. Even though I stayed the back of the pack of 8th graders, let me tell you, when you're in the 7th grade, it isn't healthy to run at the front of a pack of 8th graders. I did it once, and they pulled my shorts down to my ankles mid-stride. You don't let something like that happen twice. You stay at the back of the pack, and you learn the telltale signs of someone ahead of you who is about to spit off to the side. Danny understood this too, since he ran behind the 8th graders on the junior varsity team. They were angry 8th graders with plenty of spit. Mrs. Baker didn't understand why I was running behind anyone. She decided to give me a month off Shakespeare to coach me, since developing the body as well as the mind, she said, was humane and educational activity. So every Wednesday, she timed a 3-mile run, and I was dropping a couple of minutes with each one. This didn't include the time when Sycorax and Caliban were chasing me, when I think I might have beaten Jesse Owens. My lean was better, Mrs. Baker said, and my arms a lot looser, but she still wanted to work on my breathing. So after the 3 miles, we did wind sprints until I almost threw up, which makes you want to get your breathing better in a hurry. Mrs. Baker didn't care that I had regular practice on Wednesday afternoons after school with Coach Quattrini. If you want to get better, you run, she said. You can't possibly run too much, which I do not think is true, but probably is some sort of teacher strategy. Merrill Lee didn't understand why I was running at all, since it meant I wasn't working on the California Gold Rush and You project, and she'd already written all the notes for our report and started on the contour map. Don't think a rose and a Coke are going to get you out of this, she said, which I already knew. Remember, I'm not a jerk like Romeo. And that was why one afternoon I was in Merrill Lee's kitchen, working on making California Gold Rush relevant to you, when Mr. Kowalski came home and told us what he heard on the car radio. Martin Luther King Jr., who was in Memphis helping striking sanitation workers, had been shot and killed. He died, Mr. Kowalski said, just after he had asked a friend to play Precious Lord, Take My Hand. Merrill Lee took my hand and we went into the living room where Walter Cronkite was just finishing the news. He told us that it was all horribly true, and I thought he was shaking. Nothing will ever be the same, said Mr. Kowalski. Merrill Lee squeezed my hand hard. That night, my sister would not come down to supper, and my father did not call her down. He sat with a face as grim as President Johnson's. Every so often, he would look up the stairs to my sister's room, and then back down to his lima beans. How could this happen? He said. The next day, there were riots in Chicago, in Savannah, in Washington, in Toledo, in Detroit, in Pittsburgh, and in New York. We are coming apart, my father said. And on Tuesday, while everyone at Camillo Junior High watched on a television in the gym, my father stayed home from Hood and Associates to watch on our television 2 Georgia mules draw the old green farm wagon that carried the body of Martin Luther King Jr. through the streets of Atlanta. He didn't say a thing at supper. Neither did my sister. Just before I went to bed that night, I reminded my father that the next day was opening day at Yankee Stadium. You probably remember how we got the tickets. Remember from December. And he had promised to drive me there to meet Danny and his father and Doug and his father and to write a note to get me out of Coach Quattrini's cross-country practice for that day, to let me leave before school ended. Isn't there enough happening in the world that you shouldn't have to go into the city for a baseball game? He said. It's opening day, I said. He shook his head. He never did write the note, so I wrote it myself and got him to sign it in the morning. I told him he needed to pick me up at 12 o'clock noon, sharp, since the game began at 2 o'clock. Sure, he said, which were the same words that Coach Quattrini used when I showed him the note. You expect me to believe that your father wrote this? He said. I wrote the note. He signed it, I said. Did he read it before he signed it? No, you pied ninny, you blind mole, I wanted to say. He didn't read it. He just signs whatever I ask him to sign, like blank checks with lots of numbers to the left of the decimal point. Yes, I said. Coach Quattrini scrunched the paper into the ball and threw it at me. I won't go easy on you at the next practice, he said, as if this was something I hadn't already counted on. Mrs. Baker figured that since I was leaving early, I should do the whole day's work in the morning. When I pointed out that neither Danny nor Doug were even in class and that they were probably taking the whole day off, and maybe they were sitting in Yankee Stadium already watching batting practice with Horace Clark or Joe Pepitone hitting them out a mile, Mrs. Baker pointed out that run-on sentences were improper, and I would do well to get started on the non-restrictive clauses worksheet, which I did, since the prospect of opening day at Yankee Stadium made even non-restrictive clauses bearable, and it probably helped that Danny and Doug would have to do all the work the next day anyway. By the time noon came, my hands were blue with the fresh ditto ink, but I had finished every non-restrictive clause exercise and done the reading comprehension and even done more to make the California Gold Rush relevant to you by pointing out the perils of love and money, of the love of money, and brilliantly worded argument for Mr. Petrelli, which I handed to Mrs. Baker while everyone went out to lunch recess. Why don't you take this down to his room? She said. By that time, your father will be here. So I did, and Mr. Petrelli made me stand there by his desk as he read it over, and he pointed out the powerful use of non-restrictive clauses as he advised against the use of cliches, and he identified more than one historical inaccuracy. And as I squirmed, imagining my father standing in his three-piece suit by Mrs. Baker's desk, large and important, the Chamber of Commerce businessman of 1967, and probably 1968 too. When Mr. Petrelli finished, I hurried back to Mrs. Baker's room, since I wasn't sure that I wanted to find my father to be standing next to there being large and important. But I didn't need to hurry, since when I got to the room, my father wasn't standing by Mrs. Baker's desk. We both looked up at the clock. 12:11. 11 lousy minutes after 12 o'clock, and he wasn't here yet. I ran down to the main administrative office and called Hood and Associates. I'm sorry, said his secretary. Mr. Hood has been out at the site of the new junior high all day, and he isn't expected back until 2:30. He has a baseball game at 2 o'clock, I said. No, he has an important meeting with the Chamber of Commerce scheduled for 4:30. He wouldn't miss a Chamber of Commerce meeting for a baseball game. She was right. He wouldn't. I hung up the phone and went back to the classroom. Mrs. Baker was reading in her Shakespeare book when I came back. Oh, she said when she saw me. She looked up at the clock. Oh, she said again. Marilee came back into the room. She stood at the door, and when she saw me, aren't you? And then she stopped because apparently I wasn't. One by one, everyone came back from lunch recess, and one by one they looked at me and knew what had happened. And what was there to say? I sat down at my desk, as humiliated as President Johnson would have been if he had lost to Bobby Kennedy. My heart beat against my chest. I was surprised no one else could hear it. I suppose there may have been a more miserable hour sometime in my life, but I couldn't think of what it would have been until 1:55, when everyone had left for Temple Bethel or St. Adalbert's, and Mrs. Baker said, Mr. Hood, I think I could get you there for some of the game. The sweetest words e'er spoken. I almost cried. I took the 2 tickets out of my shirt pocket and held them up. Have you ever been to a Yankee game, Mrs. Baker? Never intentionally, she said. Call your mother and see if it's all right. Which I did, except she wasn't home, so I called my sister at high school. You're calling me at school for that? Why should I care what time you'll be back, she said, which I figured was good enough. And that was how Mrs. Baker and I found ourselves on the Long Island Expressway driving toward New York City, me looking at my watch every 3 minutes or so, and Mrs. Baker moving along at a steady 45 miles per hour in a 60-mile-per-hour zone. You can go up to 65 without getting a ticket, I pointed out. I tend to not to want to see how far I can break the law before I'm caught. You drove a lot faster than this to the hospital. Much faster, but I was going to the hospital. Today I'm driving to a baseball game. An opening day? It's just as important, I said, and I just saw you roll your eyes. I never roll my eyes, said Mrs. Baker, but if I did roll my eyes, that would have been an appropriate time to do so. The whole way, she never passed 45. She fussed at the Whitestone Bridge toll to get the right change. She fussed at the parking lot because she wanted to find space with no cars on either side, which there weren't any within 3 miles, and that was about how far away we parked. And we didn't run to Yankee Stadium in 7-minute miles, let me tell you. So it was the bottom of the 3rd inning by the time that Mrs. Baker and I reached our box seats, which were on the first base line right next to the Yankee dugout. You could make out every pinstripe on every uniform. We were that close. Mr. Hupfer got up and let me sit in front with Danny and Doug, and he sat behind us with Mrs. Baker and Mr. Swiatek. And Danny never asked about Mrs. Baker being there, even though I knew he wanted to. But I didn't care anymore because it was April, and it was opening day at Yankee Stadium, and the California Angels were out in the field, and the Yankees were up at bat. The game was everything it's supposed to be. Horace Clarke turned a double play off his heel, and Joe Pepitone caught a pop fly over his shoulder. Frank Fernandez had hit the only home run in the 2nd inning, so we missed that, which was a big deal since it won the game. And Mel Stottlemyre threw 4-hit shutout. Mickey Mantle had 2 singles, so Danny and I couldn't boo him like we wanted to. And when Horace Clarke came out of the dugout for the 7th inning stretch, he tossed 3 balls to us. We almost had another off Mickey Mantle foul ball, except it hit the bar along the box seats and skipped over us. And Mr. Hupfer and Mr. Swiatek bought us all, even Mrs. Baker, hot dogs with sauerkraut, and more hot dogs with sauerkraut, and Cokes in bottles with the ice still frozen to them, and pretzels as big as both your hands together, and then another hot dog with sauerkraut for each of us. And we shouted and hollered when the bum ump made a lousy call on Joe Pepitone. It made him strike out, and everyone, even Mrs. Baker, stood and cheered when Mel Stottlemyre retired 10 batters in a row. It was just swell. But what happened afterward? That was just swell, too. Joe Pepitone and Horace Clarke yelled up to the box at the end of the game. "Hey, Danny, Holling, Doug," they called. Just like that. "Hey, Danny, Holling, Doug." There wasn't a kid within earshot that didn't wish they were us. "Hey," we called back. "You want to come down on the field?" asked Horace Clarke, which we didn't need to answer because we were already climbing over the railing. That was when Joe Pepitone saw Mrs. Baker. "You're that dame that got us to come out to the school last December," he said. Let me tell you, I wasn't sure Mrs. Baker had ever been called that dame before, and I'm sure she wasn't all that happy about it now. Mrs. Baker crossed her arms over her chest, even though I had coached her against that. "Yes," she said, "though it was my brother-in-law who contacted you." She said it in this frozen voice that would have quieted any 7th grade class in half a second. But Joe Pepitone didn't notice. He took a step closer. "Aren't you that dame that ran in Melbourne? The women's 4x100? You anchored, right?" I was really sure that Mrs. Baker had never been called that dame twice in 2 sentences that came one after the other. "Yes," she said. "I saw that race. You were in 5th place when you got the baton, and you almost made it all up in the last 100. You came in something like 0.3 of a second behind." 2/10, said Mrs. Baker. "Hey, Horace," said Joe Pepitone, "do you know who this is? Get Houck over here. See if he remembers that dame we saw anchor the 4x100 relay in Melbourne. Get Cox over here, too." And that was why, when the photographers came to take pictures after the game, they found most of the Yankees around that dame with the legs that almost made up 5 places in the Melbourne Olympic Games in just 100 meters. And after she ran the race with them again 5 times over, she asked the Yankees to show us around the stadium, and they did. Really. Joe and Horace took us up in the bleachers to the sky-high seats, and then down beneath the locker rooms, which Mrs. Baker did not go in, and around to the offices, and then through the dugout and back onto the field. The people who were still up in the stands saw me and Danny pitch to Joe Pepitone with Jake Gibbs catching. I don't think Mrs. Baker rolled her eyes once. And afterward, I ran around all the bases, from home to first to second to third and back to home. And then I ran to the outfield and sprinted from right to left and back again. And all the while, the green grass and the yellow diamond dust were in my nose. The sun lowering over Yankee Stadium shone down on me, Holling Hood, playing center field for the New York Yankees and waiting for the crack of the bat. When you have a chance to run the outfield of Yankee Stadium, and you're not exactly sure if you'll ever have another chance, you have to take things as they come. I ran back to pitch my last pitches. The sun was getting low by the time Joe Pepitone had smacked them out, and Mrs. Baker stood at home plate, surveying the place like she was considering buying it. "What's all that scaffolding up there for?" she asked. Maybe she was considering buying it. "Repairs," said Joe. "Lots of places in the stadium need repairs. They're waiting on the boss finding an architect." "An architect?" said Mrs. Baker. Someone classical, the boss says, real classical. I'd like to meet him, said Mrs. Baker. If you can hit my fastball, said Mel Stottlemyre, I'll take you up to meet him. Mrs. Baker looked at me and rolled her eyes. Get me a bat, Mr. Hood, she said. Turned out that Mr. Hupford drove me and Danny home that night. Mrs. Baker stayed to meet the boss. So she hit the ball. Mrs. Baker's picture was in the Hometown Chronicle 2 days later, standing next to Danny and Doug and me, and all of us surrounded by smiling Yankee players. I wore Joe Pepitone's jacket to school, and Danny wore his hat, and Doug wore Horace Clarke's hat. 3 sixth graders asked for my autograph on a baseball, which I gave them. Coach Quattrini, however, did not ask for an autograph. He kept his promise. The next cross-country practice was about as hard as 2 practices put together, and since he believed in democracy, he said, he figured that everyone should have the same cross-country practice, so all 7 of the varsity runners ran like Brutus and Cassius were after them with long, pointy knives. The 8th graders loved me after that. They threw all of my clothes in the showers, and I walked home leaving puddles at every step. So when spring break finally came, it dropped as gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. Spring break. Were there any 2 words ever put together to make a more beautiful sound? Spring break. Let me tell you, the days were warm and green. Danny, Mai Tai, Marilee, and I met at Woolworth's in the afternoons. We ordered Cokes and hamburgers for as long as our allowances held out. Spring break. The high school was out too, and so my sister was always in a happy, happy mood. She had a new friend named Chit. That was really his name, and he drove a yellow VW Bug with bright pink and orange flower decals. It was mostly legs and arms and hair, and he came over every afternoon and would go down into the basement with my sister, and they would listen to her transistor radio, and then come upstairs singing about yellow submarines very loudly and laughing like it was the funniest thing in the world. Afterward, Chit would fold himself into his yellow Bug, and my sister would go driving around with him. Spring break. Warm and green days. You know they aren't going to last, but when you start in on them, they're like a week of summer, plunked down as a gift in the middle of junior high school. They mean the smell of dust and grass on a baseball diamond, the first fresh sea breezes that come all the way inland from Long Island Sound, all the maples decked out in green gold leaves. They mean checking the tennis rackets to see if winter warped them while they hung in the garage, and watching the first rabbit running across the lawn and the neighbors putting their first free kittens sign on their stoops. That's spring break. You come back to school thinking that it's no longer just the end of winter, it's almost the beginning of summer. And you figure you can hang on until the end of June because the warm breezes are coming in the window like quiet happiness. Coach Quattrini had made us swear on the lives of our firstborn children that we would run hard during spring break. He promised he would find out if we missed one day, just one day, and we would pay dearly. So when we went back to school, he began the first practice with this announcement. Every runner on the varsity team was going to have to better my tryout time with the Rats by 35 seconds. No exceptions. And no rats to help. Let me tell you, the 8th graders were not happy. Once we got started on our run, there was a whole lot of spitting to the side, timed with the wind, which I had to keep watch for. I kept well to the back of the pack, since we ran through neighborhoods where there were kids from school who knew me, and I didn't want to find myself in front of their houses with my shorts pulled down to my ankles. I was glad that Doug Swiatek's brother wasn't a varsity runner. Who knew what would have happened then? It was when we were all back from the run that first day, standing around the gym door, trying not to die, that Coach Quattrini gave his second announcement. There was going to be a Long Island Junior High School cross-country meeting this spring, just to work up excitement for the fall season. It's this Saturday, so you're all going to have to get up early and miss your cartoons, he said. I feel really badly about that. So badly, I could cry. Boo-hoo. Be here by 7. Bus leaves at 7:01. We run at Salisbury Park, 3 miles at race pace. Winner gets a $100 savings bond. Not that I expect any of you ladies to win. Toads, beetles, bats. So real quick, savings bonds. There's something that you bought, like a certificate, and they came in different amounts, and you paid half the price, but then you just held on to it. And most of them had to take like 10 or 20 years. So you paid $50 for one that said 100 on it. And if you just held on to it, then in 10, 15 years, it would be worth $100. And if you held on to it longer, it'd be worth more than $100. So you bought them, and it was something you held on to, savings bond. So something that somebody paid $50 for. If you hold on to it, it would be worth $100 or more later on. So that's what savings bond is. That night at supper, I mentioned the race. That will be nice, said my mother. Just swell, I said. Who's the coach? Said my father. Coach Quattrini, I said. My father considered this a moment. What's his first name? I shook my head. Everyone just calls him Coach Quattrini. My father shrugged, went back to eating. How far do you have to run? Said my sister. I told her. You'll die, she said. I won't die. You'll get run over and crushed. It's almost happened before, I said, with a bus. She smirked at me. Holling Hood, the local town hero. Do you want a parade? How long is it till you go to college? I said. She smirked again. Not soon enough. She's not going to college, said my father. Silence. Since that's one of those lines that gets everyone's attention. What? Said my sister. You're not going to college, said my father again. You've got a good job. You're not going anywhere. A long pause. Did you know that Roy White is batting .429? I said. I am going to Columbia University, said my sister. My father pressed his fork onto his plate and crushed a lima bean. Columbia, he said. Columbia. Let me think a moment. Isn't that the school that's on strike to protest the war so there aren't any classes? It's a school where students are striking against the war and against racism. The whole world is going crazy, my father said, and no place is crazier than college. You'll stay at your job and be safe. Safe from what? Thinking? You're staying home, said my father. My sister focused on her meatloaf. By the way, Roy White really was hitting .429, which was 205 points over his last season's average, which seems to me important enough to talk about at supper. They were all asleep when I left for the cross-country meet on Saturday morning. Actually, I was almost asleep too when I left for the cross-country meet on Saturday morning. I think I got to Camillo Junior High only by instinct. It was cold and a little foggy, the kind of foggy that goes all through you so that everything feels wet and the cold starts to seep under your skin. And all you can think about is the warm bed that you just left to do this to yourself. And you're wishing you had on your thermal underwear. And you're wondering why anyone would want to do them to themselves. And you see Coach Quattrini standing by the bus and shouting at everyone he can see. And you wonder even more, why would anyone want to do this to themselves? Neither the fog nor the cold lifted when we got to Salisbury Park. The grass was long and wet. The fog dripped down from the still fresh green leaves on all the trees. You could see your breath. You could especially see Coach Quattrini's breath because he was using it a lot, telling us where to leave our stuff, where to wait, where to stop waiting, where to loosen up, where to line up. Guess that's how we stayed warm. There was something like 20 Long Island junior high schools here, and some of them even had uniforms. Most of us just had the numbers the coaches gave us pinned to our shirts. My number was 113, which is not a particularly lucky number. Danny Hupfer's was 25, which, as you know, is Joe Pepitone's number. I asked him to change with me. Would you change with me if I had 113 and you had 25? He said. In a second, I said. Liar, he said. But when the JV boys race started, I cheered him on anyway, standing on the sidelines between Mr. and Mrs. Hupfer and a whole bunch of little Hupfers, and Mr. Kowalski and Merrill Lee, who had come out to watch us run on an early Saturday morning. That's Merrill Lee for you. It wasn't easy to pick Danny out when they started, since there were about 300 runners on the line, and most of them had on white t-shirts. But after they left and headed into the deep woods of Salisbury Park, and the thudding of 600 feet faded, we all ran to where the trail comes out of the bend and waited for him to pass. He ran through in a clump of runners, mostly bigger than him, 8th graders. Keep your arms loose, I hollered. Okay, coach, he called, heading back into the woods. And don't talk, I yelled after him. He probably didn't hear me. We ran to the next bend. When he came past, he was out in front of the clump and running well. He shook his loose arms at me. Go, Danny, yelled merrily. Faster, you dang slug, I yelled, and he obeyed. He was sprinting when we saw his back disappear. Then we rushed back to the starting line. We all screamed like crazy when he ran past in the top 10 and set off for the woods again, the second lap. There were 3 more after that. We all ran over the field to catch him whenever he came in sight, me, all the Hupfers, and Mr. Kowalski and Merrill Lee. On the 4th lap, he came across the starting line first. We went berserk. Even Coach Quattrini went berserk, jumping up and down on the sidelines, just like one of the little Hupfers. When Danny disappeared into the woods, followed by the clump of 8th graders running pretty far behind him, we ran back to the first bend for the 5th time and waited for the sight of Danny. but it was the clump of eighth grade runners that came up first. And then a whole line of other runners, all red and sweating in the cold, foggy air. Did we miss him? Asked Marilee. But we hadn't. Way more than half of the runners had gone by before we saw Danny, limping past the first bend. Both of his knees were bloody. He didn't look at us. Mr. and Mrs. Hupfer had their hands over their mouths, and all the little Hupfers asked, "What happened to Danny's knees?" "I guess he must have tripped," said Mrs. Hupfer. She didn't know what might happen if a clump of eighth graders caught a seventh grader in the lead. We ran to the next two bends and waited. Danny was falling farther and farther behind. When he finally crossed the line, he wasn't last, but almost. His parents were waiting right there. His father took one arm, his mother the other. Marilee and I stood back, and we could see Danny was almost crying. And probably not just because his knees were hurting. He didn't look at us when Mr. and Mrs. Hupfer took him back to the car, followed by the pack of little Hupfers. Some of them were crying. Are Danny's knees going to get better? I guess cross country is also a blood sport. The varsity race was next, and I lined up behind the eighth graders. Way behind the eighth graders. "Get up to the line," hollered Coach Quattrini. I moved up about a half an inch, and probably that was why, among the 140 runners waiting at the starting line, Mr. Hupfer was able to find me so easily. "I have a message for you," he said, "from Danny. I'm not sure you'll understand it." "I'll try," I said. He said, "Beat the pied ninnies." Do you know what that means? I nodded. "Then here's a message from me," he said, and he leaned closer. "Run them into the ground." But it's hard to run 139 runners into the ground, especially when the gun goes off and the thunder of all those feet takes over from the thunder of your heart. For a minute, I thought that my sister was right. I was going to get run over and crushed. So I drifted off to the side and sprinted to move ahead before the trail narrowed. By the time I reached the first bend out of the trees, I was just behind the clump of eighth graders from Camillo Junior High. By the time I hit the second bend, we'd passed most of the other runners. By the time we reached the starting line again, the 7 of us were out in front. Actually, the 6 of them were out in front, and I was running behind them. And at the starting line, this is what I saw. Mr. and Mrs. Hupfer and all the little Hupfers were behind Danny, who had not gone home but was standing there on his bloody knees and hollering as loudly as he could and waving his white shirt high in the air. Coach Quattrini was going berserk again and seemed to be trying to levitate himself off the ground. Marilee was standing quietly, but Mr. Kowalski behind her, and she held up a dried rose with a ribbon as I went by. And Mrs. Baker was standing next to her, wearing her white sneakers. So we ran again into the deep woods of Salisbury Park, the damp smell of pine thick in the air. It was as if I was running alone, the 7 varsity runners of Camillo Junior High, and when I looked back over my shoulder, I could see only a few runners behind us. And by the time we were on the third lap, we were starting to pass runners still on their second. The fog had lifted, the day had warmed, and at times I could almost close my eyes and let my feet move along the still dampened grass. And then I would find out I had come up right behind the pack of eighth graders, and they were looking back at me, and I slowed down. When we reached the starting line to begin the last lap, Coach Quattrini looked like he was having some sort of fit. I'm not sure he knew what he was hollering or if it was even English. Let me tell you, whatever it wasn't Shakespeare. All the little Hupfers were jumping up and down too, and Danny, still waving his shirt, and Marilee was waving her rose, which was losing all its petals. And Mrs. Baker was screaming. Really. We headed into the deep woods for the last time. In the cool shade of the trees, I came up close behind the eighth grade pack. On the first bend coming out, Mrs. Baker was waiting, alone. "Holling," she called, and I looked at her. "Pass those boys," she said. And that was all it took. I glided as we went into the woods again and stayed close while the trail narrowed and skittered through some thick underbrush. When it widened through a stand of old pines, the eighth graders looked behind and saw me, and they strung out to cover the whole path. So I went around them. Off the trail and through the pines, the needles thick and soft beneath my feet, the dead branches sharp and brittle against my face, and when I hit the trail again, I was ahead of them. And we were all sprinting, but they were sprinting on a cross-country trail in Salisbury Park, and I was sprinting through the cool grass of the outfield of Yankee Stadium, running down a ball that Joe Pepitone had just hit to the right, and I was covering the ground so fast my feet were hardly touching. And Ralph Hawk was shaking his head. "The kid's good," he was saying. Then everyone in Yankee Stadium was on their feet and they were screaming and screaming because now the California Angels were trying to get a ball. I had hit deep left and I was rounding first, then second, then third. Danny Hupfer was waving me home with his shirt. When I got there, the cheering erupted so loudly I could hardly hear Mrs. Baker when she picked me up and told me keep walking, and I could hardly hold the thorny stem that Merrill Lee handed me. But I sure could feel it when she leaned close to my face and, well, I don't have to tell you everything. It's April, so stay tuned for May and June.